All right, everyone. Hello. Here we go. Here's another week, and it's all about the nervous system. The nervous system. Honestly, this system is huge. Okay. And again, we're just scratching at the surface because in reality, this system is pretty complicated. We're just looking at, an introduction, right? What's a neuron? What's the central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, autonomic, etc. All right, so let's take a look. So describe the nervous system, description, primary functions, major divisions, terminology, words, drugs, diagnostic lab tests, abbreviations. Okay, so that's what we're looking at. So the nervous system. Okay, so the endocrine system was involved in controlling the body. Yeah, controlling the body using hormones. Okay, so it was controlling the body using hormones and over long periods of time. So growth, reproduction, etc. The nervous system controls the body over much shorter periods of time, and it controls the body using neurons, specifically using electrical impulses. So if I told you, raise your hand, you do that. Well, in reality, all the processing power is happening here. The neurons are sending impulses to the muscles to help you raise your hand. Very quick, right? Reflexes. And part of your so the nervous system is divided into two parts. Central nervous system, think central. So the brain, the spinal cord, okay? Peripheral nervous system, think of the periphery. So the nerves arising from the brain and from the spinal cord, okay? And really the brain is like this supercomputer. It's taking in information, it's making decisions about information, and it's controlling the body, okay? So it's a really complicated system, and the way the information is traveling is via what we call nerve impulses, electrical impulses, and it's happening in milliseconds, so happening really fast, okay? So the nervous system is usually described as having two interconnected divisions: the central nervous system, so brain and spinal cord; peripheral nervous system, the nerves, okay? Central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, enclosed bones, right? So the brain itself is a really soft tissue, and we require the skull to protect it, right? This hard tissue is protecting that soft tissue. Peripheral nervous system, periphery, going around. So we have our cranial nerves. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves coming off of the brain. And then we have our spinal nerves that are coming off of the spinal cord. And so they're like the connection between the brain and the rest of the body, right? Between the supercomputer and the rest of the body. So this is a beautiful picture, yes? So it shows, right, nerves, right? It shows the cells of the nervous system. So neurons, that's the word we use. Neurons are the cells of the nervous system. Here, the ganglia. So there are nerve cells in the brain. And then along the peripheral nervous system, there are nerve cells too, and they're in the ganglia. Now here, the tables, again, worth 1,000 words. I really would say pay attention to the tables, because the tables in, a few words gives you the basics. So neurons, nerve cells, they're the ones that are sending the impulses. Neuroglia. Neurons can be really long cells and they need help. So they need the helper cells. So the neuroglia are the helper cells. Nerve fibers and tracts, so the nerves, right? You have a bunch of parts of nerves in there. Central nervous system, yes. So receive impulses throughout the body, process information, respond. So information in, figure out what's happening, then information out, okay? The brain, the spinal cord, right? Part of the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system, right? So the links, the nerves to the other parts of the body. Cranial nerves, right, coming off of the brain, spinal nerves coming off the spine. Now, with the nervous system, there's the autonomic and the autonomic. Think of your brain is controlling your heart rate. Your brain is controlling your respiration. Your brain is controlling sweat. Your brain is controlling blood pressure. It's controlling all of these things. Do you think you are conscious of these things? Are you saying, okay, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, Breathe out. Of course not. Okay. So that would fall under the autonomic. Think of auto, self, autonomic nervous system. Okay. So controls body function, sweating, secretion, arterial blood pressure, smooth muscle, heart, stimulates the adrenals. Now, what if all of a sudden a lion came into the room and you're like, oh, I gotta book it. I'm out of here. Okay. So part of the autonomic nervous system would get your heart going, your lungs going, your muscles going. And so in the autonomic nervous system, there's what's called the sympathetic division. There's what's called the parasympathetic. Think of sympathetic when it's time to go. It's like, let's go, fight or flight. Parasympathetic, that's considered resting, digesting. When you're relaxed, no problems, and so your heart rate's calm, your respiratory system is calm. So these two, this table shows a lot, honestly. Okay, so pay attention to this table. So tissues, so neurons are the nerve cells. They're the main guys. They're the ones sending the impulses. Neuroglia, supporter cells. Neurons are so big, they need helper cells. They need helper cells to get nutrients. They need helper cells to get their ions, etc. So that's the neuroglia. So 3 types of neurons: motor, sensory, and interneurons. Okay, I'll go back to that. But real quick, so the neurons. So here's a neuron cell body. Here are the dendrites. They're receiving information. Here's the axon. It's sending away information. Okay, so here's an actual picture of a neuron. And then there are the supporter cells. The supporter cells are the neuroglia. And so different neuroglia have different jobs. You don't have to worry about that. Now with the neurons, let's say, you touch a pin and you're like, ow, okay? So that's a stimulus. The pin, the sharp end, pointy end is a stimulus. You're going to have information going up, what's called a sensory neuron, right? Sensing, okay? Information goes to your brain. In your brain, you might have an interneuron like, oh, let's process. What the heck is happening? And then you're going to have information going from your motor neuron to your muscle to go, oh, move your hand, right? So, so sensory neurons are taking information to the central nervous system. Motor neurons are taking information away from the nervous system. Interneurons are in the middle, in between. Okay. So it says motor neurons cause contraction of the muscle, secretion glands, inhibit. Okay. So transmit impulses away from the neural cell body. Okay. So it talks about more about motor neurons, what is it about them? Sensory neurons, okay, they do not have true dendrite. Okay, transmit sensory information to the cell bodies. Are sheath, resemble axons, okay, so that means nothing to you right now. So sensory can stimulate motor neurons in response to sensory information. So that's what I was talking about. Like pin, oh, sensory information, then motor, oh, move your hand, okay? Interneurons are called central or associated, located entirely within the central nervous system. So they're going to be within the brain. They're going to be within the spinal cord. They function to mediate impulses between sensory and motor, so they can be in between. Nerve tracts. So when we go, again, a picture's worth 1,000 words, honestly. So these are the nerves, okay? And what are they made of? So they're going to be made of parts of neurons, okay? And so you can have whole nerves that have a bunch of neurons in there, and they could be completely sensory, or they can be completely motor, or they could be mixed, okay? So let me go there. So that's what it's saying, right? Nerve fibers, nerve tracts, used to describe neural processes. Nerve fibers wrap protective membranes. So they can be myelinated or unmyelinated, which means nothing to you. Just know that if it's myelinated, then the information goes faster, okay? If it's unmyelinated, it's going to go slower. Yeah, and the Schwann cells are these cells that wrap around the myelin, that make the myelin and wrap around the neuron and help with nerve conduction. A nerve, a collection of nerve fibers outside the central nervous system, Afferent are sensory. So afferent, they're taking information to the central nervous system. They are sensory. Efferent, think exit. Efferent, they're going away from the central nervous system. So they're motor. Tracts, groups of nerve fibers. Okay. Transmission, there are receptors. So I said when you touch like the pin, there are little receptors and they're going to be triggered by that touch. And if it's pain, it's like ow. Okay. But the ow is being processed up here in the brain. The way electrical impulses move, it's an all or none process. So if there's enough stimuli to get the action potential going, it's gonna go, okay? And if there's not enough stimuli, it's not gonna go. What's a great example, if you've ever had like a little ant walking on your hand, and let's say you didn't feel it. You see it, but you don't feel it, okay? So that's a stimulus, but it's not strong enough to get your sensory receptors and your sensory neurons to send information in your brain. So even though you see it, you don't feel it. It says all or none response, okay, means that no transmission occurs until a stimulus reaches a set minimum strength. So that little ant crawling has to be strong enough to get electrical impulses going. Okay, so once the minimum stimulus or threshold is reached, a maximum impulse is produced. So it's going to send the information, and then in your brain you go, oh, there's an ant crawling on my hand. The information between one neuron and another, it's called a synapse, okay, the places. And the way they communicate is through neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters, those are chemical signals that are released from a neuron that can affect the next neuron. So that was kind of, it's very fast, okay? That was a real quick, dirty review of the nervous system. So sensory input, motor input, electrical impulses. The way a neuron communicates with another neuron is through a cleft, and there's neurotransmitter, okay? So now the rest of the lecture is focusing on the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so central nervous system, we're talking about the brain. The brain, when we cut into the brain, let me see. Yeah, I'm going to look at it here. When we cut into the brain, these are all made out of neurons, okay? Here is the bone, right? So here's the skull. Hard tissue protects this soft tissue, okay? Now, this is called the gray matter of the brain, and this is called the white matter, okay? Now, the gray matter consists of cell bodies, okay? So the neurons, the cell bodies. The white matter consists of the extensions, okay? So that's what they're talking about here, right? Gray matter, cell bodies, white matter, okay, the nerve fibers. Spinal cord has gray and white matter also. All right. Now, the brain, there are millions of nerve cells, okay? The largest mass of nervous tissue in the body. It's enclosed by these membranes, okay? They're called the meninges. Sometimes people say the Meningi brothers, right? The dura mater, arachnoid, and pia. So if we look at the brain, here's the soft tissue protected by this hard tissue of the skull. But what's going to protect the brain from the skull? That's where the meninges come in, right? So these are the meninges, right? The one that's really close is the pia mater. The arachnoid is this one right here in the middle. And the dura, the outer layer, that one's the really tough. It's tough connective tissue. And in reality, there's a space here, and it's filled with fluid. And that fluid is the cerebrospinal fluid. And that's going to cushion the brain from the hard skull. Okay, so you could go to a rock concert, no big deal. You moving your head. Yeah, I'm too old to do that. Okay, but that fluid is going to protect this soft tissue from this hard tissue, and the meninges are also. Okay, so dura mater, arachnoid, pia. Now, when we get into the brain, these are the major parts of the brain, okay? The cerebrum is the largest part. It's about 80%, then the cerebellum, then the diencephalon brainstem, okay? So again, a picture's worth 1,000 words, okay? Let's go there. Cerebrum, okay? This whole big thing is the cerebrum. I think of like the X-Men and Cerebro, right? So cerebrum is 80% of the brain. It's this part of the brain that is involved in higher mental functions, okay? So when you think of speech, when you think of thinking, like cognitive, when you think of behavior and learning, it's all occurring up here, the cerebrum. Okay, here's the cerebellum. That's this next biggest part. This part is involved with like equilibrium. It's involved with motor function. Okay, now here the diencephalon, that's the thalamus and the hypothalamus. These are involved, if you remember the hypothalamus, and here's the pituitary. So the hypothalamus is involved in really basic functions like hunger, thirst, day, night, circadian rhythms. And then right under it is the pituitary. And so the hypothalamus would be involved with the pituitary. Now here the midbrain, the brainstem, midbrain pons, cerebellum, no, midbrain pons right here. And then the medulla oblongata. They're not a very big part of the brain, but this part of the brain is essential. It is crucial. For example, you can get into a car accident, okay? And if someone damages this part of the brain, they can still live. They can survive. If they damage this part of the brain, not very good. Because this part of the brain is involved in really basic functions. This part of the brain, the medulla oblongata, this is called like the reptilian brain because it's involved in heart rate. It's involved in respiratory function. It's involved with very basic necessities. So we cannot do without that part of the brain. Okay. All right. So just like before, oh, here we go, right? This has cerebrum, cerebellum, brainstem. Okay, the infant here talks about the cerebrum, but here, just like before, here we have a table. And again, the table is very helpful, okay, because it says the main functions, okay? So what do I want you to remember? All right, so cerebrum, it's controls sensory motor activity, sensory motor. So that part is also involved in motor function, okay? Sensory perception, emotions, consciousness, memory, voluntary movement. So really big part. Again, there's a picture in your book. Talks about the different lobes of the brain. Again, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Here it is. So here's the cerebrum, okay? For example, here involved in speech, movement, sensation, language area. The occipital lobe is vision. Here, hearing, smell, right? So here's the cerebrum, okay? I'm going to go back to that table. So there's the cerebrum. Cerebellum, role in sensory perception, motor cortex, muscles moving, okay? So coordination, equilibrium. Diencephalon, the thalamus, relay center for sensory impulses, okay, thought to be involved with emotions, arousal mechanisms. Hypothalamus serves as the principal regulator of autonomic nervous activity, behavior expression, hormones, okay. Again, water balance, sugar, fat metabolism, body temperature, sleep control, appetite, sexual arousal. So that's the hypothalamus, that's a little part. Then brainstem, midbrain, really sending that information. Pons, same thing. Here it says somatic, visceral control, importance in regulating breathing. So pons, really important. Medulla oblongata acts as cardiac, respiratory, vasomotor control, regulates controlled breathing, swallowing, coughing, sneezing, vomiting. So all of this is part of the brainstem, that little part of the brain. That is that reptilian brain that's really important because it's involved in really basic functions. So here, right, the rest of the lecture shows the cerebrum, let's say, that heart, okay? You have the gyri and the sulci, kind of those like little grooves. The gyri are the things, the grooves here, the sulci are the pits in there. Cortex, okay, the frontal lobe, okay, motor area, personality and speech, that's up here in the front. Parietal, that's on the side, sensory input for all parts of the body, okay, interpretation of language. Parietal, up here, parietal, temperature, pressure, touch, awareness, muscle control. Temporal, contains center of hearing. Occipital, way in the back, that's for vision, okay. Cerebellum, second largest part, okay. All right. So, important role, coordination of voluntary and involuntary complexes, maintain posture. Diencephalon, so that's now we're getting in the middle, second portion of the brain, thalamus, hypothalamus. So it talks about the thalamus, relay center. You can think of thalamus, relay center. Okay, also controls behavior. Okay, hypothalamus, that one's a biggie because it's going to control the pituitary. Okay, so in principle, regulator of autonomic nervous activity associated with behavior, emotional expression, produces neurosecretions, water balance, sugar, fat metabolism. Pituitary, right? That's the major, remember that little gland that have to do with the endocrine system. Brain stem, lower part, right? And so here it talks about visual, auditory, sensory information, consciousness, sleep cycle, and then the pons, okay, so talking about that, really tracts moving through, medulla oblongata being, even though it's a small part of the brain, nerve centers for regulation, control of breathing, swallowing, coughing, sneezing, vomiting, heartbeat, blood pressure. So really important. So here's a picture showing the cerebrum and the different parts. And then the other picture, again, I would definitely, if I was trying to learn this stuff, I would definitely be looking at a picture and then looking at the table, because the table quickly summarizes what's happening. And then the picture, for me, being a visual learner, it really helps me to see a picture, because I'm like, oh, it's this part of the brain that does this, it's that part of the brain that does that. So here's a picture, right? Here's a sagittal or mid-sagittal cut, and we're seeing a lateral view, and we could see this, right? And then, and again, I would look at the table, okay? And then over here is the cerebrum and the parts and the roles. If this was an anatomy class, you would need to know every part and what it did. I just want you to get a general idea in our class. All right, what about the spinal cord? Okay, so the brain is a supercomputer. It has to be able to communicate with the rest of the body. And it does that through the spinal cord, okay? And the spinal cord is an H-shaped gray area. Again, if you look at it, right, here's the brain, here's the spinal cord. They've done a cross section through the spinal cord. It looks like an H, okay? Now what happens is the gray matter swaps to the middle and the white matter is outside, okay? And so the cell bodies are in here, the neuron cell bodies are in here, and then here are the extensions, okay? So what is happening, okay? White matter, nerve tracts, sensory input, conduct motor impulses, okay? So there, again, a picture worth 1,000 words again, right? So you could see that. Oops. All right, parts of the spinal cord. The region between the 12th thoracic and L1, right? Conus medullaris. Terminal thread, okay, don't worry about this. These are talking about the specific parts of the spinal cord. Cauda equina, when we get to, here's the spinal cord, right? And so the spinal nerves, if there are vertebrae here, and then the space in between the vertebrae, you're going to have spinal nerves coming out, okay? And if you remember cervical, that was the neck region. So literally like C1, C2, C3, and then you'd have the spinal nerves coming out of there. Thoracic, T1, T2, the lumbar and the sacral, okay? Now the spinal cord ends about here, and then there are these nerves that are radiating out, and it looks like a little tail. So it gets the terminology cauda equina. Cauda equina means horse's tail, okay? So it's those nerves that are radiating. Horse's tail, cauda equina. Terminal portion of the spinal cord forms nerve fibers that are lumbar, sacral, coccygeal, spinal nerves. Functions of the spinal cord. What does it do for you? It is that relay station between the brain and the rest of the body, okay? Conducts sensory impulses to the brain, okay? So if we touch that pin, the information has to go up, up, and through the spinal cord to the brain. And it's in the brain that we go, ouch, that hurt. And it's in the brain that we go, okay, send impulses back, move your hand, move your finger, right? So conduct motor impulses from the brain, serve as reflex center. Of course, the spinal cord is a reflex. What's the point of reflexes? The point of reflexes, they are really quick responses and they are protective, right? And you don't think about it, you just do it. So they're automatic, subconscious responses to stimuli with a protective nature, okay? Cerebrospinal fluid. So there's fluid that is, we talked about the brain and the skull, there's that cerebrospinal fluid in between here. There's also cerebrospinal fluid in between the spinal cord too. And same thing. So here with the spinal cord, the vertebrae are what are going to protect the spinal cord. And then the fluid in between the meninges, right, and the bone, that's going to protect the spinal cord also. So CSF, colorless fluid, surrounds the brain spinal cord, produces filtrate of the blood. It's really like the fluid portion of the blood. Circulates to the ventricle, central canal, subarachnoid space. Arachnoid villi, that means nothing to you. Let's look at a picture or not. Okay, that doesn't help. Okay, so let me go back to this picture real quick. Okay, so here in the brain, okay, this particular picture doesn't show it very well, but there are these they're not big, okay, there's these spaces in the brain, and they would release the cerebrospinal fluid, okay, and the cerebrospinal fluid would go down, okay, and then go here in the subarachnoid space, and then go here around, okay, so, and it bathes, right, the brain, it bathes the spinal cord, and the whole point is to provide that cushion and that protection, okay? So if someone has meningitis, okay, meningitis, that would be inflammation of the meninges. How would they know? So they can do a spinal tap, right, where they could take some of the fluid out and they can analyze the fluid, you know, what's going on. Are there any bacteria? Are there any white blood cells? What's going on there? Okay, so, okay, let's go back to the meninges. We just went through a lot here. Okay. All right, so cerebrospinal fluid, right? So it says, serves to cushion the brain and spinal cord from shocks that could cause injury, helps support the brain by allowing it to float in supportive fluid, carries neurotransmitters, so it could do that too. Peripheral nervous system. So literally the nerves that are radiating out, okay, there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves radiating out directly from the brain. And then there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves connected to the spinal cord. Cranial nerves, they're called 1 through 12. Literally, it's like cranial nerve number 1, cranial nerve number 2, da, da, da. And they innervate areas around the head. Okay, so cranial nerve number 1, where is it? It's this one, olfactory. So literally, it's involved in smell. Okay, you have these neurons at the roof of your nose, and they're going to take impulses to the brain. In the brain, you smell what you smell. Olfactory. Okay, cranial nerve number 2 is optic. Okay, they're going to take information with the eyes here. So et cetera, et cetera. You do not have to know every cranial nerve. If this was an anatomy class, we would have to learn every cranial nerve. We're not going to do that in this class. Just know these are the 12 cranial nerves. They innervate the head. Some of them go out and they go far. They don't just innervate the head, like the vagus. The vagus is a very famous cranial nerve because it innervates the heart, it innervates the digestive system, so really the lungs, right? So important here. So here it talks about each cranial nerve, 1, 2, 3, 4, da 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 da. Let's go. There's the vagus. Controls muscle of pharynx, larynx, thoracic, abdominal organ, swallowing, voice, slowing heartbeat, accelerate peristalsis. So pretty important here. And then the peripheral nerves. So the spinal nerves coming off of the spine, okay? So they would be here. So again, it would be C1 through C8. And if you look, they're going to go. And so they can be sensory, so taking information to the central nervous system. They could be motor, taking information away. Yeah, so just know about them. Okay. All right. Now, finally, okay, and again, we said we're doing a very, very quick nervous system overview, right? So finally, the autonomic nerve, okay, so you have conscious thought, okay? But then you have like subconscious parts of the brain that are controlling these things that you're not thinking about. You don't think about digestion. You don't think about your heart rate, right? So that would be under your autonomic nervous system, okay? So part of the peripheral nervous system controls sweating, secretion of glands, arterial blood pressure, smooth muscle, heart. Okay, so primarily composed of efferent. So remember, exit efferent, so motor is going to control. Can be functioned into sympathetic and parasympathetic. So again, sympathetic, think of fight or flight, get your heart going, get your lungs going. Parasympathetic, think of resting, digesting. Again, here's a picture. Look at the picture. It's lovely. This picture gives you kind of a whole general representation of the nervous system. So nervous system, we have the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord. So we can have sensory, motor. Peripheral nervous system, that's all the yellow. Okay, so you can have somatic, voluntary. Somatic is going to control the skeletal muscle because your nervous system controls your skeletal muscle, okay? Then the autonomic nervous system, that's going to control, it says smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands. And in that part, we can have the parasympathetic, resting, digesting. So it's going to slow your heart rate. It's going to slow digestion. It's going to slow respiration. The sympathetic, that's your fight or flight. So it's going to get your heart rate going. It's going to get your respiratory system going. So nice overview of this whole thing. All right, so finishing up with this chapter. So they're talking about that. Okay. So finishing up with this chapter, some of the disorders that can happen with the nervous system, and the nervous system being such an important system, okay, such an important system. So these are just some of the things that can happen. So Alzheimer's, we've heard of that. Not every, okay, growing old, okay. When people grow old, they might have problems with memory. That's kind of a normal process of getting older, okay? Alzheimer's is not the normal process, okay? Alzheimer's is they're having more issues with memory, with functions. So it says Alzheimer's disease, 80, affects a person's ability to carry out the activities of daily living. Involves part of the brain that control thought, memory, language. So with Alzheimer's there's dementia, there are so many subcategories, okay? It says Alzheimer's is not a normal part of aging, okay? So not everybody that gets old, hopefully, if they are going to live that long to get old, yes, not everybody who gets old is going to have Alzheimer's, okay? So it says, however, after age 60, there's an increased risk of it. What are the symptoms? Anger, aggression, anxiety, apathy. Well, you can see that, right? If someone's not processing things correctly, they can get confused. And if someone's confused, you can see they can get angry, they can have anxiety. eventually people with Alzheimer's have a really hard time just taking care of themselves, like eating, they forget to eat. Taking care of themselves with hygiene, they forget how to do that, dressing themselves, etc. It's a physical process. We're not quite sure what's happening. The brain, it talks about it in your book, Alzheimer's disease, progressive degeneration, the brain tissue, okay, slow decline in memory. So they don't talk about it. The brain develops these plaques. We're not quite sure what's happening. There are some medications to try to slow it down. There's a lot of research going into Alzheimer's. Cerebral palsy, right? Cerebral palsy is an issue that can happen in utero. It can happen after delivery. And the child, again, there's a problem with the nervous system and the child has problems with motor function. So cerebral palsy, it says disorder of movement, posture, cause, because remember, the muscles could be completely, totally okay, but it's the brain, it's the central nervous system that's controlling the muscles. And if there's damage to the central nervous system, then it might not function properly, and then the muscles can't do their job properly. Okay, so it says a disorder of movement posture caused by damage to the motor control centers. Motor, we're talking about parts that are involved in controlling muscle. Okay, of developing brain and can occur during pregnancy, childbirth, after birth, up to the age of 3. So this child has these braces, right? It has a hard time with controlling his muscles and standing. Most common permanent disorder of childhood involving 4 motor dysfunctions: spastic, dyskinetic, ataxic, and mixed. Okay, this child with cerebral palsy has abnormal muscle tone and lack of physical coordination. That's what they're showing here. Craniotomy, what does that mean? Okay, that's what it means, cutting into the skull. There are tons of videos online. There's a particular video called, oh, let me remember. Oh, I'll remember it. I'll put it on our page. It's really, really good. And it shows doing certain surgeries to help people. And the thought of cutting through the skull and getting into the brain sounds really scary, right? But sometimes they have to do that, depending on whatever the issue is. If a person has a stroke, or if a person, whatever, right? That if they have to have surgery, they might have to cut into the skull. All right. Epilepsy, you may have heard of epilepsy and seizures. Kind of interesting. We don't quite understand them, okay? Where the brain, and remember, it's electrical impulses moving through, and there's a disconnect where the electrical impulses are not moving through properly. And so when a person has seizures, they're having loss of control there, and the brain is not working properly. Different people have different types of seizures. You just got to try to support the person while they're in a seizure until they come to. And seizures can happen early on in life. They can happen later on. They can have a genetic component. So yeah. It says a child having seizures gently assisted to the floor, placed on the side, right? If you can help them get to the floor, that way they don't get hurt, okay? Because if they fall and hit their head, now they're going to get hurt, yeah. Okay, so paralysis, types of paralysis. Again, why would that happen? Because ultimately, it's the brain that's controlling the muscles. So if something happens, like a stroke, and the motor portion of the cerebrum that controls the muscles, if it gets damaged, or if there's a problem with the spinal cord and there isn't communication between the brain and the rest of the body, someone could be it says quadriplegic. Quad means 4, right? So quadriplegic, so paralysis with all 4 limbs, right? Complete or partial paralysis of the upper extremities, complete paralysis of the lower body. Hemiplegia is paralysis of half, which can happen especially with stroke victims. With stroke victims, if they have damage on one side, then the other side is what they lack control with. And then here, paraplegia, paralysis on lower body. So for example, let's say someone gets into a car accident, and if they damage their spinal cord and that information to the brain is not going through, now they might have total paralysis on the body. And from what we understand, okay, if a neuron gets damaged, you don't make new neurons. But if parts of neurons get damaged, they might be able to fix themselves. So spinal cord injuries and research into spinal cord issues is a big deal, right? Because we can help people. Herniated disc, you hear about people getting herniated discs. Between the vertebrae are these cartilaginous discs, and they cushion in between. Well, they can get damaged, right? It says cross-section showing compression of nerve root. And then if they get damaged, they can compress on the nerves, so the person can get paralysis, they can get tingling, they can get pain. So they might have to have surgery, right? So they're showing surgery. Now, the problem with surgery is it's not 100%. We don't know how the body heals. Some people heal well, some people don't. So it's always a risk. Having surgery. Herpes, we've heard of herpes. What is it? What is it tied to? Do you know? It's tied to chickenpox, right? So chickenpox, where is it? Viral disease characterized by painful vesicular eruptions, long segment. Okay, so chickenpox, we never quite get rid of the virus. So the virus is still there in our ganglia. And later on in life, so someone could have had chickenpox early on in life. And then later on in life, let's say they're really stressed out, or they're having autoimmune issues, whatever the case may be. If they're immune compromised, they might have herpes, they might have shingles. That's what we call it later on. And it does not feel good, right? It's painful. It says shingles. I'm going to read what it says in the book. Caused by varicella zoster virus, the same virus that causes chickenpox. In people who have had chickenpox, the virus never fully cleaned from the body. Instead, the virus remains dormant in the nerve tissue. First signs, often burning or tingling pain, or sometimes numbness or itch on one side. Okay, so yeah. Hydrocephalus, what does that mean? We're talking about water. Cephalus, cephali, we're talking about head. So here, this is a good picture. It shows the ventricles. They are the things that are making the fluid for the cerebrospinal fluid. And it says, the figure on the right shows a shunt inserted. So if there's an issue with the fluid and the fluid builds up too much, it says bulging fontanelle, and then hydrocephaly. They can have really big heads, literally, if they're babies. Because the baby's skull, the bones are not quite fused yet, okay? And if there's too much cerebrospinal fluid, the skull can actually get big, right? The bones can actually move. So here it says bulging fontanelle. So the way to cure that, right, they could put a shunt to try to drain the excess fluid so the baby's head, the skull will return back to normal. Microcephaly, what do you think what does micro mean? Small. And cephalic, we're talking about head, right? So sometimes that happens, okay? Babies get really tiny heads. That sounds funny, but it's not funny because it's real. And with the Zika virus, right, that was the big deal. If women got Zika virus, then some of the women had babies with microcephaly, and so that was a problem. Meningeal seal, right? Is here it's the CSF, here are the meninges, and there's excess fluid, so it looks like this lump, congenital abnormality of the spine. Multiple sclerosis, okay? Multiple and sclerosis. It has to do with the nerves, and it has to do with the myelin sheaths. Remember we said myelin, and to have quick responses here, and something happens to the myelin sheaths, and so now the electrical impulses are not relaying as fast as they could before, and there's all kinds of repercussions as a result. This is on page 509, right? So if the brain is having problems with communicating with the rest of the body, you can see the rest of the body is going to have problems. So diminished cough reflex, respiratory infections, urinary issues, gastrointestinal, muscular, neurologic, sensory, because those nerves that are myelinated, they start losing the myelin, and that communication slows down. Neurofibroma, what are we talking about? Tumors, okay? So having to do with that. Poly, many. Neuro, itis. What's itis? Inflammation. Embolus traveling to the brain. Okay, in this chapter, they talk about stroke, okay, or cardiovascular accident, okay. So here's the organ systems really are working together. An organ system does not work independent of another organ system, okay. So here, right, here's the cardiovascular system, here's the nervous system, and let's say if someone has a blood clot, right, so an embolus, and it goes in, and let's say it gets into the brain, and what if it stops the blood flow to that part of the brain? I know we've talked about this before, but in the book, this is a really nasty picture, yes? Yes, okay, here's the brain, right, here's the cerebrum. You can see the gray matter. See the gray matter? Here's the white matter. Here's the ventricles. That's where the fluid would be circulating. Yeah. Here, look at this. Doesn't this look nasty? It's like, what happened? So there was huge hemorrhaging. I mean, this is all blood. This is all old blood. So if a stroke, right? If a vessel bursts, okay, if the tissue dies, okay, the central nervous system, that tissue cannot regenerate. It does not fix itself. So the damage can be permanent, okay? Or the damage can be fixed. It all depends on how bad the damage is, okay? What parts of the brain are affected, and can the person relearn using different neurons, making new pathways, relearn certain functions. So it says the risk of a stroke doubles with each decade after 55. Stroke occurs in men more than in women, and very common cause of stroke is atherosclerosis. Remember, atherosclerosis, hardening plaque in the arteries. Fatty deposits, blood platelets collect on the wall of the arteries, forming plaques. Over time, the plaques slowly begin to block the flow of blood. The plaque itself can block the artery, enough to cause a stroke. So they talk about thrombus, they talk about embolism. What are the symptoms? What are the signs of a stroke? Numbness, weakness in the face, arm, leg, confusion, trouble speaking, understanding, trouble seeing in one or both eyes, trouble walking, dizziness, loss of balance, severe headache with no known causes. So those are the symptoms in the book. This is on page 514. This is awesome. It's called FAST test. Okay, FAST test. Help spot symptoms. So face, FAST, F-A-S-T. So F is for face. Ask them to smile, right? Remember, the brain is controlling the muscles. So if they can't smile or they're drooping on one side, then there might be an issue with the brain, okay? So ask for a smile. Does one side droop? Okay, that might be a sign they're going through a stroke. Something's going on. Arms, when raised, does one side drift down? Again, if they can't control, right, something's going on with the brain. Speech, can the person repeat a simple sentence? Does he or she have trouble or slur the words? Okay, slurring, okay. And time is critical. Call 911 immediately if any symptoms are present. People calling for help and getting help is crucial. Depending on when the person gets help, that can really minimize the damage, and that could really make a difference in, if they're able to, first of all, if they're able to survive, and then secondly, to minimize the damage as much as possible, and can they regain bodily functions, right, with the brain. So stroke, FAST, okay? So face, arms, speech, and time. All right, so that talks about that. Yeah, so that talks about all the things we talked about. Finally, drugs, analgesics. What are analgesics, right? They're going to help with pain, yeah? So whenever they say analgesics, that's what we're talking about, inhibiting ascending pain pathways. Anti-Parkinson's. Oh, we didn't talk about Parkinson's, but they talk about it in the book. Anticonvulsants, cholinesterase inhibitors. Cholinesterase, that's talking about acetylcholine. That has to do with communication with the brain. Okay. Anesthetics, yay for anesthetics, right? Local anesthetics, right? So lidocaine is a huge one. General anesthetics, right? So if they're going to have big time surgery, they'll put someone under general. Diagnostic test, angiography, right? X-ray records cerebral arterial system, cerebrospinal fluid analysis. So that's what we're talking about if they're going to do a lumbar or a spinal. CT scans, encephalography, ultrasound looking at the brain, EEG, that's looking at the electrical impulses in the brain. It says measuring electrical activity, so what's happening. Lumbar puncture, right? So here it shows how they do that, right? So the person has to move forward. When they do that, then this space in between the vertebrae, there's a little more space there, and literally it's kind of a little eerie. Okay, the doctor will literally, they're going by feel, okay, and they're going to feel through. The needle's super long, okay, and they're going to feel through as they go, and they want to get to here, and they want to get the fluid, okay, if they want to analyze the cerebrospinal fluid. Myelogram, spinal canal, okay, neurologic examination, right? So that would be like a neurologist would look at the patient. PET, kind of really neat. You can always go online to look at these images. Ultrasound, ultrasonography of the brain, right, to look at the brain also. And finally, abbreviations. Acetylcholine is a huge neurotransmitter that is released, affects muscle function. It's released by the neurons, affects muscle, Alzheimer's, etc., etc. All right. So I'm going to go back there. All right, so that finishes up this chapter. I put it all together in one big lecture. You're really happy about that, huh? So please look at the study and reviews at the back of the chapter. They're very helpful. Please do the homework just like usual. And please do the My Lab activities, okay? This was a lot. The nervous system is a lot. The nervous system, frankly, is incredibly amazing. There's so much to learn about it, and there's so much we don't know. There's so much we don't know still, okay? But anyway, hopefully you had a good time, and good luck, and homework, My Lab, okay?